So we are in this series called Recapturing the Wonder, and we've been talking about how the world is disenchanted. And even if you were here last week, we had Andrea and Mackenzie from Italy, and they were just sharing about, hey, what is life like in Italy, and what's like religion, spirituality, and I want to be clear when we talk about a disenchanted world. It's a world that functions as if there is no God. And so they're even talking about like Italy, like they would acknowledge like, oh yeah, there's a God, and maybe I'm part of this denomination or this religion, but functionally don't act as if there is a God. And also I want to be clear on a second thing. Last week's class with Brandon started like, hey, what is the world secular? And what does that even mean? And what the scriptures say, even though the world functions as if there is no God, we can be sure that God is at work. God is always at work. Even with people in rebellion against him and turning from him and unaware of him, you can read through the scriptures, he is working all things for his good and for his purposes. So although we function as if God is not existent, we can trust that he is. And that's what we want to help us see, like, how is God at work? How do we know him? How can we see him? But if a world functions as if there is no God, then a couple outworkings that we've talked about is kind of part one and part two this week. One thing that we talked about last week is results in greed. If there is no God, we need to hoard as much as possible, one, to try and satisfy the desire for God, and just we think stuff might satisfy, and also to make sure we can take care of ourselves. And so we live in a culture that kind of hoards and gathers and has a bit of a scarcity mindset, like, hey, I might lose everything, so I better get as much as I can. And then a second outworking of this would be anxiousness or worry. If there is no God, or if we're going to function that way, a natural outworking is to be anxious, is to worry. Darrell Bach, talking about this section in Luke, said, greed can never get enough. So greed, we can never get enough. So we always have to have more and to be satisfied, and so we gather. But worry is afraid it may not have enough. We're constantly worried we may not have what we need. We can never have enough. And yesterday, I was thumbing through social media, and Scott Sauls is a pastor up in Nashville, and he talked about, he said, affluence can be a breeding ground for anxiety. He said, affluence can be a breeding ground for anxiety. I want to hit a pause right here. If you're in this room, if you're in the United States, we kind of fall into the category of affluence. All right? I know we can have a different picture of affluence around here, because we're like, oh yeah, those people are affluent. I'm not. Globally, if you're here, affluence is us. He says, but affluence can be a breeding ground for anxiety because it creates the illusion of being able to purchase comfort and control. It creates the illusion of being able to purchase comfort and control, but eventually gets exposed in a fallen world, because not even money can secure for us the world we long for. Money can't secure for us the world that we long for. It can't fix the problems that we face. But again, it can breed anxiety. It breeds worry. And so what we see here in Luke chapter 12 is a movement that Jesus gives us from anxiousness to awareness. So Jesus warns us, and he exposes us about what anxiousness is, and then he calls us to be more aware of who God is and live in light of this. Anxiousness is, you don't even have to be like into psychology or anything to know that the level of anxiousness and anxiety is on the rise. Anxiousness, just from 2020 with COVID, has increased 25%. Like that's a large number. Like there's 25% of more people are more anxious. Like, and I fall in that category. I am more anxious now than I was before. But if you look even before COVID, from 2008 to 2018, anxiousness and anxiety was up 50% over what it used to be as well. And so anxiousness continues to increase. Another thing that we see in our culture is a decrease of attention spans. Okay? If you have kids, you know this. If you're an adult, you know this. One author talked about, like, yeah, people are worried about, like, kids and their attention span and what technology is kind of doing that. He's like, I'm actually more concerned about the adults than I am the kids. So we all struggle with this. And in the book, Recapturing the Wonder, Mike Cosper put it this way. He says, what if the trouble with attention isn't merely that we've been trained for constant stimulation, okay? The phones, the technology, we were having the conversation this morning, like kids kind of always grabbing for it or wanting that, me kind of always grabbing for and wanting that. But also that constant stimulation is addictive precisely because it distracts us from the anxieties of disenchantment. So if we live in a world that is disenchanted, a world without God, one, there is just a lot to be anxious about. In general, that should lead to anxiety. But also if the world is void of God, if it's empty, if it's meaningless, if it's destined to be forgotten, why give ourselves to anything anyway? Like, why would you invest in anything that matters? If nothing matters, then why do we invest in it at all? Why give yourself to anything? And so we might as well just distract ourselves. And we live in a culture of distraction. And it leads to anxiousness. And Jesus warns against this. Now, Jesus says like lots of offensive things to our sensibilities, to our culture. Like we think of things of like maybe like sexuality, and even last week, greed and stuff like that. I feel like this is one of the most offensive things that Jesus could say to our culture. Look at verse 22. He said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. Jesus says, do not be anxious. Verse 29, and do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, nor be worried. I think Jesus' call to not be anxious, to not be worried, is offensive to our world. Why? Because we're all anxious. We're all worried. And Jesus said, hey, don't do that. Don't be anxious. Don't be worried. But Jesus doesn't just warn us. What we've been talking about this in the series, that he shows us he shows us an ancient path. He shows us a good way that we've been talked about, that Paul laid out in week 1. In Jeremiah 6:16, it says, stand by the roads and look and ask for the ancient paths where the good way is, and walk in it, and you will find what? Rest for your souls. What's the opposite of anxiety and worry? Rest, peace. And Jesus says, I want to show you this way. I want you to live this life. And a quick side note, he says, I tell you, in verse 22, the majority of Jesus' audience, who he was like teaching this to, so these would just been like, there's people sitting there, some guy asking him questions, and he like kind of ignores this guy and turns around and starts talking to everybody else. Those people would have been poor. The majority of the people that followed Jesus, that were around Jesus, that looked to Jesus, they lived day to day. It was a big deal to give away a garment because they had one. So if they lost the garment, what happens? They have nothing. They would have been more destitute than we are. So this is even a more offensive command to them. I don't want you to be worried. You don't have anything. Like the things that we often get anxious and worried about aren't to the level of like, hey, we're not going to have a home tomorrow. We're not going to have clothes tomorrow. Or we're not going to have food tomorrow. Now, I do think there's different things that cause an increased anxiety and increased worry in our culture and our time, things that we think we need to have. But what Jesus wants to show us is how to find freedom from anxiousness, particularly in regards to provision. And I'll look at 4 things or 4 ways. One, he gives us this command to look, to pay attention. He tells us to listen, to leave ourselves to his care, and ultimately to live free from anxiousness and for God's kingdom. So first, he gives us this command, this vision, to look, to pay attention. Look at verse 24. He says, consider the ravens. Look at the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouses nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Oh, how much more value are you than the birds? Jump down to 27. What does he say? Consider, look, pay attention to the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? God's first command to rid of anxiousness is to pay attention to what's going around you, to look around. And he used the example of ravens. Ravens were like an unclean bird. If you go back to the Old Testament, there would have been things that God gave his people, that they would be a set-apart people for God. Hey, these are the people that are trusting in the one true God, the God of Israel. And so you're going to eat this way, you're not going to eat this way. You're going to live this way, you're not going to live this way. And so he would give them these things to show that they were set apart, that their trust was in God. And one of the things that the raven was an unclean bird. And he says, your Father even feeds them. He says, are you not of more value than the birds? If you go back to Genesis 1, God creates all things, and then the pinnacle, the highlight, the top of all creation is humanity, is people. We are the image and likeness of God. So if God's going to take care of the ravens, the unclean birds, he's going to take care of you. I think there's something here, too, that God's gracious, God is goodness. He takes care of those that don't even trust in him, that don't believe him, that live as though he doesn't even exist. He gives breath, he gives food, he gives clothing to everybody. He's a good God. He says, look at the lilies. They don't even do anything. He says they don't even really have a purpose other than to look good. They're here for a day and then they're gone tomorrow. He clothes them with beauty and splendor. How much more will he clothe you? And so in one sense, if we want to rid ourselves of anxiousness, it's very practical. To pay attention, to observe nature. And as Darrell Bach said, understand that God is in the business of meeting needs. As you look around, as you see the world function, you see a God who provides. He provides the water, he provides the food. Pay attention. Look. If you're anxious about what you have and what you need, look and see how God provides. But I think there's more going on here, because when you pay attention, you realize not just that God cares about you and he will provide for you, but you see his goodness. When you stop and look around, you see his beauty. When you stop and look around, you see his delight. God could have just given us food that would sustain us, but what did he do? He gave us food that tastes good, right? He didn't have to put flowers out there. They don't do anything. What do? They just look good. They bring delight. They bring joy. They bring beauty. I've talked about this, we got this little pattern of going on walks. And it's a healthy practice, because what we do, we're walking around, talk about like the affluence, there is beautiful landscape everywhere. Or I'll go on a bike ride. I'll park on the south side of Jupiter Island and just ride north, and you ride through all these. It's magnificent. It's beautiful. And you can just stop and say, man, look how God made that. Look at this. Look at that. You can see God's beauty everywhere, his beauty, his delight. Cosper in his book said, to pay attention is to attend to something, to be present. He says, we attend because the world isn't cold and it isn't empty, but filled with the presence of God. When we stop and when we look, when we pay attention, we can see the beauty and goodness and the presence of God. I just saw Bree on the way in. She went on this epic trip out west with her dad, and just even seeing the pictures was amazing. It was wonderful. It was beautiful. He says, every moment, every encounter is meaningful and numinous. All ground is holy ground. So Robert Propone wrote, man's real work is to look at the things of the world and to love them for what they are. He says that is, after all, what God does. And God was not made in the image, man was not made in God's image for nothing. If you go through Genesis 1, God created everything, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6. What did he do on day 7? It says that he rested. Doesn't mean that God stopped sustaining the world, that he just tired after those first 6 days, it means that he stopped, that he enjoyed his creation. He saw it and it was good. And we're called to do the same. So we don't just pay attention and look to be reminded, oh look, God, fed the birds and he made the flowers grow. He's going to care for me. Like, no. We stop and we see that God is a good Father. He gives us beautiful things. He gives us good things. Paying attention reminds us that God cares for us. And as we see his beauty, as we see his goodness, as we see his delight, you know what goes away? Anxiety, worry. Have you ever sat at the ocean, like on an evening, and just kind of sat there and looked out? And what do you see? Beauty. We were just talking to our friends from Texas. The water is beautiful this time of year. What happens? Nothing else really matters. Everything kind of goes away. Why? When we're seeing at the beauty and delight and the goodness of God. So we need to develop practices that allow us to not be distracted and anxious and looking everywhere, that actually allow us to see the beauty and the goodness of God. We need to learn how to look. We need to learn how to pay attention. And our anxiety will lessen. The second thing we see in this passage is that we need to listen to the wisdom of Jesus. I was meeting with Brandon this week. He was teaching the class this afternoon. And he said, Jesus is the wisest person to ever live. Jesus has wisdom. He's immensely practical. If you kind of pay attention to what's going on, we were talking about this a little bit. Even my nephew that just went to college, he's reading a book by a sociologist guy, Jordan Peterson. He's become very popular. And one of the reasons that he's become very popular is because he gives wisdom. He helps people live. We live in a world that says you can be anything, you can do anything, you have to decide what you are. And guess what kids are? Really confused and overwhelmed. Like, I have trouble deciding what kind of cereal I want for the morning, right? But when we have to decide all this, what people are seeking, what people are looking for, they're looking for wisdom, how to live. How do we make sense of this world that we live in? And there's no better person to look to for wisdom than Jesus. The scriptures say that he is the wisdom of God. And so if we're anxious, if we're worried about something in life, whether it's what you eat or what you wear or what you're going to eat, where's the best place to look? To Jesus. Who's the best person to listen to? Jesus. Verse 25 says, "And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his lifespan?" He says, if then you are not able to do as a small a thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? What is he saying? He's saying, like, you can't add to your life by being anxious, by being worried. It's not doing anything for you. He gives us wisdom. Because worry is really illogical. Think about it, worry. What do we worry about? That things are going to go bad? That things may not happen the way that we want them to? But what Jesus says is not only does worry not add anything to life, has worrying about anything ever made something better? No, even on Sunday night, Brandon said this. He said, anger has never made anything better. Same thing with worry. Doesn't make anything better. It doesn't add to life and it makes nothing better. And actually, what worry does is it shortens life. I'm sure we have some doctors in here. Literally for your health, worry causes your life to be shortened. And actually, worry makes everything worse. One commentator said that worry loads the present with the weight of the future. Worry loads the present with the weight of the future. Jesus says, don't be worried about tomorrow. Today has its own trouble. Worry about it. N.T. Wright put it this way. He says, as with so much of his teaching, what Jesus says here goes to the heart of the way that we are. This is where Jesus gets offensive and convicting. It goes to the heart of how life actually is. None of us see, don't be anxious. Like, not Jesus. I don't really struggle with that one. It says, to inhale a bracing lungful of his good sense is health-giving at every level. If we take into the wisdom of Jesus, if we listen to Jesus, anxiety goes down. The wisdom of Jesus both exposes us and gives direction. It reveals the foolishness of worried. Jesus says, what are you worried about? You can't do anything about it anyway. I was talking to a friend. I always watch people that are like a step ahead of us. And so maybe it's just we're not there yet. We're getting closer to this sending your kids off to college deal, which I'm watching. I know it's heart-wrenching. I'm praying for everybody, right? So I was talking to a friend, and somehow their kid's phone was still connected to their phone. And so somehow when the phone died, then it like pings them. So kid's phone died at like 1:30 in the morning. And then it shows where the phone died. And it died right at a hospital. And so the parent got this ting that the phone has died. Not only has it died, it's died in like the emergency room. So they like leaned over and talked to their spouse like, hey, the phone died. Like, I think they're in the hospital. And they're like, well, it was the husband goes, okay, like I was in college. I went to the ER 4 times. My parents knew nothing about any of them, right? And they go like, looked over and said, what can you do about it anyway? You can't do anything. And they're like, but I'm worried. I'm anxious. I don't know what to do. He's like, well, you can't go there. You'll humiliate them. You can't show up at the hospital with all the friends and all this stuff. So he's like, all right, call the hospital. So you can't call. He's like, you can either call the hospital or go to sleep. That's your wisdom. That's what you can do. Call the hospital. Hey, blah, blah, blah. They're there. No, nobody here with that name. They're okay. Okay, like there. But what happened? Stayed up from 1:30 to 7:30. What? Anxious, worried. So, like, Mom, I have no idea what happened. Yeah, my phone died, but I was in my bed sleeping. And they're like, we're at some apartment. I was like, I don't know if it was up by a hospital or not. Like, nothing was going on. Right? But what? Anxious, worried. We live this way, but we need wisdom. You can't do anything about it anyway. Go to sleep. Third thing, how God's ways, God's path frees us from anxiety. We need to leave ourselves to the Father's care. Leave ourselves to your Father's care. Look at verse 29. And do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, nor be worried. He says, for all the nations of the world seek after these things, and what? And your Father knows that you need them. I got stuck on the word seek. He said, do not seek what you are to eat. One commentator said, we should not be excessively distracted about our physical circumstances. Don't be excessively distracted about our physical circumstances, what we're going to eat, what we're going to wear, where we're going to live. I mean, we got TV shows on all this junk, don't we? What are they telling us? Worry about what you're going to eat. Worry about what you're going to wear. Worry about where you live. They're making millions. Heck, we just visited 2 towns because of them. Jesus says, don't be distracted by all of it. Bach said it's just wrapping paper around that which is truly life. What we eat, what we drink, where we live is just wrapping paper around that which is truly life. Bach goes on, he says, the first step in wisdom is to know better. We ought to leave ourselves in the Father's tender, loving care. He says, worry casts doubt on God's care. I don't know if there's a slide for this or not. Worry casts doubt on God's care. So Jesus addresses them as people of little faith. You're having a lack of trust in God. He says the essence of trust is to recognize that God will take care of what is in his hands. The essence of trust, of faith, is to recognize that God will take care of what he has. At the core of Christianity is that we have a Father in heaven who will take care of us. Every good father takes care of his kids. How much more so your Father in heaven? God will take care of for you. God will provide for you. He knows what you need. In my little, reading plan, I've in Revelation and Deuteronomy, which is exciting. I wake up like, it's intense. But in Deuteronomy 18, so you read the old stuff. There's good stuff in there as well. It talks about provision for the priest. I know I'm not technically a priest, but I'm a pastor or whatever. And what it talked about is, guess what? I am dependent. For our livelihood, we are dependent on what people give to the church. Guess what? I don't like being dependent. You know what I like? Being independent. When we went to go right out of seminary and we were trying to decide, hey, I just kind of thought we had this little horseshoe like everybody else. We moved from St. Louis, Karina had a 3-year contract, I had a 3-year degree. We'd kind of do a loop back up to St. Louis, and I would get a nice job at the church that we came from, and it was growing, and it was great, and it would have been full time, and all this stuff. And then we're like, hey, maybe God's doing a bunch of work right here in Orlando, and Karina's like, I don't know why, but you're kind of in the middle of it all, and you just kind of happen to show up, and God's doing all this stuff. She's like, maybe we should look and listen to what God's doing, and maybe come alongside and stay here. So long story short, to do that, we needed to raise money. It was a brand new church. We're still raising money for this church. It's 16 years later. And so I went back to St. Louis to the church, and I was talking to the pastor, and then I was talking to a couple other pastors that kind of knew me and knew my story. And I remember sitting on the corner outside of the church at this conference they were having, and Trey Herrick, who I didn't really even know that well, he's like, hey, yeah, what's going on? What do you have next? And I was telling him about, hey, I think God's calling us to stay in Orlando and help plant this church, but we're going to have to raise money. And I was like, I don't like that. And y'all can see my arrogance. I was like, if I want money, we make money. I come from a sales background. That's what you do. If you need more money, guess what? You go make it. You go earn it. And he lovingly and kindly looked at me in the face, and he goes, that's pride. That's arrogance. This job calls for you to trust that God will provide for you through other people. I don't like that. We're dependent. I was looking at it, we're as a pastor, as a priest, we're in the same kind of category as the orphans and the widows. The church is providing for it. I want to just be able to do it. Hey, we need more money, I'll go make it. All right? But that's not the way it is. And if I would have kept that attitude, which was terrible, I would have missed out on all that God has provided. We've been doing this for 16 years. God has given us and blessed us and cared for us in ways that are just beyond our imagination. This church is super generous. He cares for us. And the truth is, the reality is, that we're all dependent. And we all need God to provide for us. And we need the trust that he will care for us. We need to leave ourselves to our Father's care. And you know what? God he doesn't just we've had what we needed plus some. Last night, somebody gave us tickets to the Dolphins game. So I got to drive our kids down to preseason game, sit in these awesome seats, bring a friend. It was great. It was amazing. God didn't need to do that. But I enjoyed it. Why? He doesn't just give us the minimum. He wants us to care for him. And as I was driving down there, I was thinking as I was driving back too, our kids, the kids that were with me, had no awareness of what was going on. We got there oh, we're here already. We got home. Oh, we're home already. What did they do? They trusted me that I would take care of them, that I would get them there, that I'd get them home, that they would what? Have what they need. I'm like a decent dad, right? Lots of room for improvement. If they can trust me, how much more can we trust our God and our Father in heaven? That he will care for us. If you're anxious, if you're worried, you have a Father in heaven that cares for you. A Father in heaven that makes pretty flowers just to make pretty flowers. That makes beautiful things just to make beautiful things. He will care for you. Last thing, to be freed from anxiousness, we need to live free from anxiousness and free for God's kingdom. Live free from anxiousness, we need to live free for God's kingdom. He says, for all the nations seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. He says, instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. You know what you should do instead of being anxious, instead of being worried? Seek his kingdom. Seek God's kingdom. The kingdom of God is life under the reign and rule of God. Life under the reign and rule of God. Isaiah 52:7 says, your God reigns. It's just living in light of that. Living in light of your God reigns. Dallas Willard, which a lot of the spiritual formation stuff is coming from that Brandon's teaching, and it is on like, okay, how do we do this? Willard says, how do you seek God's kingdom? Find what God is doing and acting with it. What does God say is good and right? Invest in that. Matthew 6 says, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. You want to seek the kingdom? Find out what God's doing and be a part of that. Find out what God says is good and right. Invest in that. I told Karina I was going to steal her notes. That song, Behold, you want to know what God's about, what God's doing? The empty filled, the wounded healed, the broken back together, the poor are blessed, the weary rest, we will dance forever. The blinded see, the chained are free, the doubtful now believer, I'm not singing for you, the outcast known, the orphan home, you are my Redeemer. The lost return, the voiceless heard, the mourner now rejoicing, the mountain shake, the world awake, creation all composing. The sad untrue, the earth renewed, the song has found its singer, the darkness light, the dead alive, you are my Redeemer. You want to know what the kingdom about God is about? That. Find out who's broken. Find out who's wounded. Find out who is struggling with belief. Find the poor. Find the weary. Bring it back together. You want to know who's poor? You want to know who's weary? You know who's empty? You want to know who's wounded? Everybody. And God has you there to bring hope, to bring joy, to bring life. Wherever you are, seek the kingdom. Be about the kingdom. You know what it does? Anxiety just wastes away. That's what I love about the formation class. Brandon talked about last Wednesday about our social dimensions. You want to live this out? Live according to the kingdom? He says, live according to being made whole. That we are actually being formed to be like Jesus. He says, life in the kingdom, defensiveness is gone. People are no longer your enemies, and you're no longer against people. You live according and with a generous love. Read through Romans chapter 12. That you're about redemption and restoring all things. That's what we seek after. That's what we pursue. To become like Christ and help others become like Christ. To live with hope and joy and restoration and help others have hope and joy and restoration. This is how anxiety drips away. And it's a matter of trust. How can we know that we can believe and trust in God? That he's doing all these things. In order to do that, we need to consider Jesus. We need to listen to Jesus. We need to look to Jesus. As we look to him, we can trust that God has done what he says he will do. As we look to Jesus, we can trust that God will meet our needs. That's our deepest need. Look at Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. He says, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. People are what? Weary and weighted down. He says, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. You want anxiety to wash away? Look to Jesus. He endured shame. He was naked. He was hungry. He was thirsty. He was separated from God. Why? So we could be clothed. So our thirst can be quenched. So we can be filled up. So we can be robed in his righteousness and his goodness. Look to the wisdom of Jesus. 1 Corinthians 1, 23 to 24. We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to the Gentiles, a stumbling block and folly to the world. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. We live in a world that displays power and wisdom by gaining, and it's led to an anxious, angry, greedy world. Jesus shows that true life is found by giving, by trusting. We look to Jesus. We trust that God will care for us. Romans 8:31-32. If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us, how will he not also with him graciously give all things? We can trust that God will care for us because he gave us himself. He's our greatest need. He's our most beautiful gift. We can trust that he will give us all things that we need. And it's through Jesus that we can live for the kingdom. Jesus says, I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Willard again says, keys don't make you the owner over something. They give you access. Jesus gives us access to the kingdom of heaven. I got keys to this place. I got an extra set because I lose them a lot. I don't own this place. What do I have? Access to it. We can use it. We can live in it. Do what we need to do. Can't do everything, which I found out last week when we rolled out their nice gymnastics thing that wasn't supposed to be for our use, but we had a fun time with it. Right? Why? Because I don't own it. But we have access to it. We don't have to be anxious because we don't own the kingdom. We're not in charge of the kingdom. We have access to the kingdom. We have power to live in the midst of it. And so whatever you're anxious about, whatever worries you, Jesus wants us to find freedom from that. And we do so by looking to him, by listening to him, by leaving ourselves to his care and living for his kingdom and purposes. Let's pray.